You ever stop and think about why you find something absolutely hilarious, but the person next to you just doesn't get it? Or maybe you've noticed your sarcastic streak is, well, a carbon copy of your dad's. Today, we're going to get into that, tackling one of the big ones. Is your sense of humor something you're born with, or is it something you pick up along the way?
So let's just ask it straight up. Is your sense of humor in your genes? For the longest time, this was a complete mystery. But now, thanks to some really fascinating research, we're talking studies with thousands of twins, we're actually starting to get some answers. And trust me, the answers are way more interesting than a simple yes or no.
Okay, so before we can even start looking for a genetic link, we got to figure out what we're actually measuring, right? I mean, a sense of humor is, well, it's just way too broad. So to get scientific about it, researchers had to create a way to break it all down into specific, measurable styles.
And this is what they came up with. They basically boiled it down to 4 main types. You've got 2 positive styles. First is affiliative. That's all about using jokes to bond with people, making friends laugh. Then there's self-enhancing, which is when you use humor to cope with stress, to find the funny side of a tough situation. On the flip side, you've got 2 negative styles. Aggressive humor, that's your classic sarcasm or teasing. And then self-defeating, which is pretty much what it sounds like, putting yourself down to get a laugh. Now, we all do a little bit of each, but most of us definitely lean towards 1 or 2 of these.
All right, so now that we have these 4 distinct styles, scientists finally had something they could actually measure. And to tackle that classic nature versus nurture question, they turned to the gold standard, the most powerful tool in their toolkit for this kind of thing, twin studies.
Now, the logic behind twin studies is actually pretty simple, but it's also kind of brilliant. Think about it. Identical twins share 100% of their DNA. They're genetic copies. Fraternal twins, on the other hand, share only about 50%, just like any other brother or sister. So if a trait, like a humor style, is way more similar in identical twins than it is in fraternal twins, well, that's a massive clue that genes are playing a big role.
And that is exactly what they found. In one huge study, we're talking almost 2,000 pairs of twins in the UK. They had everyone fill out that Humor Styles Questionnaire. And the results? They were just unbelievably clear. For all 4 humor styles, the identical twins were way more alike than the fraternal twins. No ambiguity at all.
And here's where it gets really compelling. This wasn't just a one-off. A totally separate study, this time with almost 1,000 twin pairs down in Australia, decided to test the same thing. And guess what? They found the exact same pattern. I mean, when you see results replicate like that across different countries, you start to think, okay, this is real. The genetic link looked pretty undeniable.
So let's just pause and take stock. The evidence seems pretty overwhelming at this point, right? Your tendency to be sarcastic or to use humor to cope, it all seems to be, at least partly, written into your DNA. So, case closed? Your sense of humor comes from your genes? Well, not so fast.
Because just when everything seemed to line up perfectly, another group of researchers approached the whole question from a totally different angle. And what they found? Well, it threw a giant wrench into everything we thought we knew.
See, instead of asking people how they use humor, these scientists asked a different question. What do you find funny? Now, that might sound like a small change, but it's a huge, incredibly important difference. They were measuring something they called humor appreciation. And their experiment was pretty straightforward. They got 127 pairs of twins together, and they showed them 5 of those classic, quirky, Far Side cartoons. You know the ones. And all they had to do was rate each one on a scale of 0 to 10. Simple as that.
But the results? They were the complete opposite of those big humor style studies. They found literally 0 evidence for genetic influence. None. Instead, any similarities between the twins' ratings seemed to come entirely from their shared environment. Growing up in the same house, going to the same school, having the same friends.
So, now we've got a genuine scientific puzzle on our hands. We have 2 sets of really solid research, and they're giving us 2 completely different answers. One side is saying your humor style is in your genes. The other is saying your humor appreciation is all about your environment.
So what is going on here? I mean, how can both of these things possibly be true? It feels like a total contradiction, right? But this is what's so cool about science. There's actually a really elegant explanation that makes sense of all of this.
So, how do we solve this puzzle? Well, the key, it turns out, is hiding in plain sight. It's all about what exactly each group of scientists was measuring.
And here it is, the big reveal. Your genes seem to influence your humor style, that general tendency to be sarcastic or to make light of a bad situation, but your humor taste, what specific cartoons or jokes you find funny, that seems to be learned from your environment. So you have an innate style, but a learned taste. It's a perfect explanation. But just when you think you've got it all figured out, one more study came along and added one last fascinating layer to the story.
See, when a different team of researchers decided to run that same Humor Styles study, but this time with a North American group of twins, they got a slightly different result. And this little difference revealed just how powerful our culture can be.
Okay, check this out. In the UK and Australian studies, remember, both the positive and the negative humor styles showed that genetic link. But in the US study, only the positive styles did. The negative ones, like aggressive, sarcastic humor, seemed to be almost entirely based on environment, on what people learned. So, why the difference?
While the researchers themselves pointed to a perfect and probably very familiar example, the TV show The Office. In the original British version, the boss David Brent is, well, he's brilliant, but his humor is often really cutting and cringy. Now think about the American version. Michael Scott is a goofball, for sure, but he's much more lovable and kind-hearted at his core. And this could point to a real cultural difference in how much that biting, aggressive humor is accepted or encouraged. And that right there might be the final piece of the whole puzzle. It suggests that you could be born with a genetic tendency towards sarcasm. But if you grow up in a culture that kind of frowns on it, you might learn to suppress it. That gene might never get a chance to fully express itself. In a way, culture acts like a volume knob for our DNA.
All right, we've been through the twin studies, the cartoon mystery, and that final cultural twist. So let's bring it all home and lay out the final answer. So where does your sense of humor come from? It really is a story of both nature and nurture. Think of it like this. Your genes might hand you a blueprint for your general humor style, your natural inclination, but it's your environment, your family, your friends, the culture you live in that teaches you what is funny. It builds your specific taste in jokes, and it even decides which parts of that genetic blueprint get turned up or turned down.
And that leaves us with one last thing for you to think about. Next time you're with your family and you say, "We all have the same sense of humor," what do you really mean? Are you talking about a shared fundamental style, like you're all naturally sarcastic or you all find the absurd in life hilarious? Or are you really just talking about your shared taste, the fact that you all quote the same movies and laugh at the same old inside jokes? Chances are, it's a little bit of both.